Greetings, colleagues and enthusiasts of corporate law turnout. My name is Mathews Okoth, and I take this chance to again welcome you to this program through which I serialize some of the lead corporate news items in Kenya, particularly as carried in the Business Daily newspaper, with a view to identifying some of the legal issues that those news items raise. The program is based on reporting in daily newspapers, and this is episode 7 of the program. In episode 6, I discussed a mode of company distribution called dividends. I identified what dividend means, justified why companies pay dividends. I identified the sources, legal sources from which companies pay dividend, and the consequences for unlawful distribution of dividends, particularly as against directors and shareholders of a company. Now, episode 6 discussion was based in the context of a storyline carried in Business Daily newspaper for March 17, 2022, titled "Corp Maintains Dividends as Profit Up 53%. Now, there's an aspect of that news item that reported on, how Cooperative Bank actually finances its operation in the year 2021, and it was claimed that a lot of the funding of the bank's activities in the year 2021 were done by way of retained earnings. That is one form of corporate finance. In this episode, I will discuss in greater detail the forms of corporate finance in Kenya. And it is important to appreciate at the outset what really corporate finance is all about. So corporate finance concerns ways in which a company raises finance. And as a legal concept, it also concerns the legal framework against which a company raises finance and the constraints that a company has to comply with if it opts for one form of finance over another. We will all agree that companies need finance to finance their various activities. For instance, a company needs finance to fund physical assets. For instance, its machineries, its equipment, including motor vehicles, even its office space. So financing of physical assets is one of the key requirements for finance by a company. Companies also need finance to fund their human resource, their operational expenses, including staff salaries and other operational expenses such as taxes and other utilities, including electricity bill, water bill, among other utilities. Also, a company needs finance to finance its raw materials and other inputs. Lastly, a company may be said to need finance, not just to finance its day-to-day activities, but also to fund a return on investment to various investors in the company, and not just to debt investors, but also to equity investors. You will remember that in episode 6, we said that there are instances that may arise in a company where, say, there is a gridlock in the running of the company. And the only way to break that gridlock is to buy out some of the shareholders. If the company has to do that at a time when it doesn't have sufficient resources at its disposal, it will have to find a way through which it raises money to finance the share repurchases. Okay, so those are some of the ways or activities that a company needs finance for. But more crucial is that finance is like the fuel. It's like the fuel that the company burns on its day-to-day activities so that it remains in business. So what are the forms of corporate finance. And when we talk about forms, we are actually talking of the various sources from which a company can actually raise capital. One of the ways is through equity finance. And equity finance arises where a company issues shares that are then subscribed to by investors in the equity of the company. Now, when these investors pay for their subscribed shares, the company generates finance that it then can use as part of its capital. There are reasons why a company may opt for equity finance. For instance, if a company is uncertain about the regularity of its revenue to pay returns to investors, one of the benefits that it derives by attracting equity finance is because there's really no guaranteed return on investment. Like we said before, a shareholder, particularly an ordinary shareholder, is a residual risk bearer. And more crucially, he or she is not entitled to automatic return on their investment. And so because of that lack of guarantee on the return on investment, there's some element of flexibility, albeit in the short run, that the company and its managers enjoy if they attract equity investment. However, in the long term, equity financing is inflexible in the sense that the financial relationship between an equity investor and the company is always long-term. So, and other than just being long-term, there are certain control rights in consideration for this risk of even non-repayment of any return on their investment. The law confers on equity investors a control right, including the power to vote in and even vote out the directors of a company. And so on account of that, in the long term, equity financing is inflexible from the perspective of a company. But in the short term, it is a very flexible form of financing because there is no guaranteed return on investment. On the other end of the scale is debt financing. And debt financing arises in two ways. It can arise from loan financing, or if a company is trading in a recognized stock exchange, it can arise through issuance of debt securities. Now, loan financing can take the form of on-demand loan, what is popularly known as overdraft facilities. Or it can be a term loan if it is to be repayable in a predetermined period, as long as, of course, the borrower continues to comply with the terms of the financing. So loans is one of the form of debt financing. There are also what we call debt securities. And this applies to companies that trade at a recognized stock exchange. At times, companies issue what are popularly known as bonds, which are debt instruments. And there are various variants of bond depending on the tenure of the particular bond in issue. There are those that, particularly on the maturity tenure of the bond, there are those that mature, meaning they are due for payment within 12 months from the date that they are issued. There are those that have a maturity period between 1 year and up to 7 years. Then there are those which are long-term, between 5 years and at times even up to 25 years. So the debt securities can, depending on the tenure of their maturity, can either be a commercial paper or a note, or strictly speaking, a bond. But the crucial point is that another form of financing by a company is through debt financing. Now, in the short term, Debt financing, from the perspective of a company, is inflexible. Why? Because its key characteristic is that there is a predetermined return on investment. Debt investors are said to be risk averse. They are not enthusiastic about taking excessive risk in their investment. So there are always contractual stipulations on the interest that they're entitled to be paid, and when that interest is supposed to be paid. So in the short term, yes, from the perspective of the company, debt financing appears inflexible, but the advantage of debt financing is that in the long term, the moment that the company pays off the interest and principal amount owing to a debt investor, their relationship ceases. And there is no control right that the debt investor then acquires over the management of the company. Now, the third form of financing is what is reported in the news item that we referred to, retained earnings. At times, a company may generate income from its operations, and in lieu of payment of dividends to its shareholders, it may decide to plow back that income towards the running of the company. That is the whole idea of a retained earning. It's kind of an internal form of financing, because is a financing that is generated from within the business itself. Okay, so just to be clear, it's not just when a company fails to pay dividends that it can be said to have retained earnings. There are instances where a company opts for a non-cash payment of a dividends, what are called stock dividends. You remember in episode 6, we said that dividends can be paid either in cash or in a non-cash form. There are instances where a company can decide to issue a lot new shares to its shareholders, equivalent to their entitlement to dividend, okay, or repurchase existing shares and then redistribute those shares again to its shareholders. Okay, so if a company pays for dividends in cash, still it will have its retained earnings that it can then plow back into the business and to of course fund its various operational activities. So the third form of financing is what is called retained earning, and is typical of very large companies that make a lot of profits. So those are the key. There's a fourth key form of financing that I will discuss lastly in this episode, called mezzanine form of financing. But let's look at others. When companies are starting out, some of these main forms of financing may not be available to them. They are because of the excessive risk that potential investors or financiers may think that they have. So there are other forms of financing that are typical of relatively small companies, or not really small, but at least not companies that are fully established. And one of the forms is what is called a credit card financing. A credit card financing is just a line of credit that a financier allows a company to have, so that the company can purchase whatever goods or services that it seeks beyond the amount that the company actually has in its bank account. And on a periodic basis, the company will be required to pay for the excess drawing on its account, of course at an interest. So it is a line of credit, and it is typically there will be a credit card that is issued in the name of the company, but to company managers. It's common to be issued to managing director or some senior officer within the company. And the crucial point is that credit card facility is intended to finance company activities. There are instances where people have lost job for use of credit card for financing for their personal uses. So if it is used for personal uses other than company activities, then I think such an employee or staff will be putting himself or herself in a position where he may be prone to disciplinary action. Crucially, credit card financing is a line of credit to the company itself. So it is intended to be used for company uses. Now, a credit card is different from a debit card. Debit card is not a line of credit. A debit card, when someone holds a debit card, what essentially happens that upon purchase, first you must have sufficient funds within your account, and upon purchase of either a good or a service, that your account will then be debited from funds that are still available in your account. It's not a line of credit. The line of credit is credit card financing. Now, there is another form of financing called invoice or trade credit financing. It is not always that when companies purchase goods or services, they pay for them upfront. At times, there is always a credit period that the supply of the goods extend to the company. And that's the whole idea of invoice or trade credit financing. I'll give a more practical example. Assuming that a company procures raw materials from coffee farmers. So the coffee farmers may supply coffee beans, to the company, of course, for processing. And there's a time lag between the date of the supply of the coffee beans and the date when they actually paid, maybe a 3-month time lag, depending on the purchase contract that the company has with the suppliers. Okay, so unwittingly, these coffee farmers will be financing the operations of the company within that period when the coffee beans have not been paid for, and quite often at no interest charge. Because the alternative would be that if that form of financing were not available, the company would have been required to obtain maybe credit from a commercial bank and pay for the coffee beans upfront before they can purchase. And of course, that facility would come at an interest. So the advantage of invoice or trade credit financing is that it is cheaper because ordinarily there is no interest that is payable within the credit period that is permitted by the supply. Now, there is another form of financing called accounts receivables financing. Now, account receivables financing can be construed from the perspective of the supplier. Debts are a form of assets. And if we are to use the same example of a coffee bean supply, the farmer, from the perspective of the farmer, upon the supply of the coffee beans to the company, they anticipate a payment, maybe 3 months from the date of supply. So if they need money upfront, perhaps maybe to finance their continued farming activities, they may assign that right to be paid by the company to a financier, including even a financial institution. That act of assigning the right to be paid under debt to a third-party financier is what is called accounts receivables financing. In legal parlance, it is called factoring, in the sense that whoever finances this particular supplier will be taking a number of risks. And so the supplier will ordinarily be expected to discount the amount of money that they would be financed by a given margin to reflect the loss that this particular financier is taking. So assuming that the supplies were for 100,000 shillings, In accounts receivables financing, you may find the financial institution, upon assessing the risks associated with this financing, may agree to give a maximum of 90,000 shillings, a concept called factoring. So accounts receivables financing is one of the forms, one other form of financing. Now, the other forms of financing, there's what is called a hire purchase agreement. At times, a company may obtain the right to use an asset without necessarily paying for it upfront. So the arrangement can be that the company pays regular installments, typically monthly installments, to the vendor, of the particular equipment that is financed through hire purchase, and upon payment of the full purchase price, that is when the property in the finance asset passes to the hirer, to the company. We believe that is financed through hire purchase. Okay, so the legal issues that are always critical to look out for in hire purchase financing is that if the finance asset has a value in excess of 4 million, then it has to be registered within the hire purchase registry. And secondly, there's a limitation on the right of repossession of the assets, particularly where the hirer, in this case the company, has paid up to 2/3 of the value of this finance asset. The vendor has to obtain the leave of court before it can repossess that particular asset. So it's important to look out whenever you get instructions on hire purchase. Be clear on the value of the finance asset and the amount that is already paid by the hirer. Okay, that's the data. Now there is another form of financing called lease financing, and I believe this is common to lawyers. I mean, most of us occupy offices that are on leasehold. Okay, and so a leasehold is just a right of use of an asset by payment of regular rent to the vendor. Okay, to the lessor. In this case, it's not the vendor; it's the lessor. Okay, so but it's not limited only to office space. There are very large commercial contracts on lease financing that involves equipment. For instance, for a very long time, I think our police service, the vehicles for the National Police Service were financed through lease financing, and there are very many cases in Kenya law on lease financing, particularly involving vehicles leased to the National Police Service. So why would a company opt for lease financing? The critical consideration is always to cushion the company against what is called depreciation risk. There are assets that may be critical to the running of the activities of the company, but they have a high depreciation value, and so to protect the company against the depreciation risk, they can opt to go for lease financing, to lease the equipment or the particular office or even asset. Also, maybe the company does not have sufficient money. If that particular asset is not prone to depreciation, it is cheaper to finance the asset by way of lease rather than to obtain a debt from a bank or a commercial bank to purchase the asset outright. Now, related to lease is what is called a leaseback financing. Now, a leaseback financing is actually is a form of financing that whereby the vendor, the owner of the asset, sells the asset, but reserves a right. There will always be a condition within the contract itself. Reserves the right to lease back that particular asset whenever the vendor requires to use the particular asset. And this is common with assets that at times are dormant, that are not used full time. For instance, example that comes to mind is assuming a particular supplier or vendor deals in tractors, okay, and is also a farmer, and that particular supplier relies on rain-fed farming. So during drought, at least in a particular region, this particular supplier can opt to sell the tractors so that they get some financing upfront that they can then invest in alternative ventures. But they reserve the right that when the rainy season starts, they would lease the particular tractor to assist them with their farming activities, of course, at a rent. So that is the whole idea of leaseback financing, the right to lease back the particular asset that the vendor already sold to a third party. Now, so those are some of the forms of financing. Some are available to startups, that is companies that have higher levels of risk. But some, the key ones that we discussed are debt, equity, and retained earnings, which are typical of established companies. Now, there is another form of financing that cannot be placed, as either debt or as equity financing, and it's called mezzanine form of financing, and it draws from those who know what a mezzanine floor is. It's really not a floor for living. In between a basement and a first floor, there will be a floor that perhaps is just used for some storage activities or some menial work, but it's not really a substantive floor for living. So we can analogize mezzanine financing with that. The key characteristic of mezzanine form of financing is that it has characteristics of debt and also characteristic of equity financing. And the common form of mezzanine financing is what I call preference shares. Remember, we said that shareholders, typically, they are not guaranteed of any return on their investment. But that is not what preference shareholders actually have. They acquire an automatic right to a return. And that right is cumulative, meaning it is rolled over a number of years if it is not paid at a particular point. So that element of lack of guarantee to a return in ordinary shareholders then disappears when we talk of preference shares. Okay? So to that extent, a preference share then resembles more of a debt, which also has a kind of a guaranteed right of return. And this right of return to preference shareholder is always contained in the constitution, in the articles and the memorandum articles of the company. Okay? Now, one key thing that though distinguishes preference shareholders from debt investors, among other things, they acquire the right of enforcement of their debt, and including they can even commence insolvency proceedings against a company if a debt is owing. A preference shareholder does not have such a right. What happens if a company is unable to pay this fixed return to a preference shareholder? The preference shareholder will roll over that right to the following year until a time when the company is in a position to pay for the preference, for the return on the preference shares. So there is no right of enforcement to a preference shareholder, and to that extent, a preference shareholder then also mirrors ordinary shareholders. They differ with a situation in debt investors who acquire a right of enforcement of outstanding debt. Now, another form of mezzanine financing what are called convertible bonds. There are instances where a company, particularly companies that are trading, there are instances where a company may issue bonds that entitle its holder to a right to convert those bonds into shares at the instance of either the company itself or the financier, okay, the lender. And the companies always do this if they anticipate that, yes, much as at the moment they are capable of repaying returns on these to this bondholder regularly, maybe in future they may not be regular in repayment of the interest. Okay, so they then retain a clause within the financing contract that entitles the holder of the particular bond to convert those bonds into shares. Of course, the rate of conversion is predetermined within the financing contract itself. Okay, so those are called convertible bonds, bonds that entitle the holder to convert into shares at a particular point in future. Now, the last form of mezzanine form of financing are what are called warrants. Now, warrants are also forms of bonds. They are debt financing. Primarily, they are a form of debt financing. However, rather than giving a right to convert, warrants, how they differ from convertible bonds, give an additional right to its holder to acquire shares in the company if there is an outstanding debt that is due from the company. So that whereas from the onset, the holder of a warrant is a debt investor, if an incident occurs that is envisaged within the financing agreement, for instance, a default in the repayment, one of the rights that the holder of a warrant acquires is the right to acquire shares in the company. Of course, also predetermined within the financing agreement. So a warrant is not a convertible bond. It is a bond that its holder continues to retain as a debt instrument. But in addition to that right as a debt investor, the holder acquires a right to acquire shares in the company, thereby becoming, in addition, also a shareholder in the company. And when, of course, the moment that this bondholder becomes a shareholder, there are certain control rights. There are control rights that the investor then acquires, where, notwithstanding that initially this was a debt investor. So that actually summarizes the forms of corporate finance in Kenya. I have identified and tried to define what corporate finance is all about as a legal concept. I've then also identified the key sources that a company can rely on to finance its activities. I've discussed the various activities and the importance of finance to companies' operational activities. Thank you very much for listening to me in this program. Again, my name is Mathews Okoth, and I continue to urge you to subscribe to my channel if you find these recordings helpful. Bye-bye for now.